Satanists don't wear gold. It was a rather unusual wedding, to say the least. The bride, adorned in a modest calf-length white dress with delicate lace sleeves, stood out starkly against the cold, austere environment. Her attire, traditional yet tinged with an air of quiet resilience, seemed almost out of place in such surroundings. Meanwhile, the groom, less elegantly attired, donned a rather ill-fitting set of prison blouse, trousers a touch too long, with shirt tails carelessly left untucked. The contrast between them was palpable, she radiant with nervous excitement, he displaying an uneasy demeanor that belied his usual composed facade. This peculiar ceremony occurred on the 3rd of October 1996. Within the formidable grey-walled main visiting room of California's infamous San Quentin prison. The bride, one Doreen Leary, then 41 years of age, was a freelance magazine editor, holding a bachelor's degree in English and boasting an impressive IQ of 152. The groom, however, was none other than the notorious serial killer and rapist who, at the time, resided on death row, awaiting his eventual execution. To turn back the clock some 7 years earlier in 1989, this man had been convicted on no fewer than 43 counts, which included 13 brutal murders. It is widely believed by authorities that his malevolent actions extended far beyond these convictions. From the spring of 1985, for well over a year, the people of Los Angeles County were gripped by an unyielding fear, a fear of the unknown. An ominous figure who came to be known as the Night Stalker. His nightly reign of terror forced many residents to change their habits, secure their homes with stronger locks, and invest in the most advanced security systems available at that time. The press aptly named him the Night Stalker, for he prowled the dark like a creature of the night, leaving horror in his wake. The visiting room at San Quentin, a place designed more for function than comfort, was a rather drab affair. Rows of orange plastic seats firmly bolted to the floor lined the room, while an assortment of vending machines stood like sentinels against one wall, offering meager distractions from the grim environment. On this particular day, the room was teeming with other prisoners and their families, all gathered for their scheduled visiting hours. Yet despite the crowd, a notable distance was maintained around one individual, the infamous inmate whose name had once sent shivers down the spines of many. Indeed, the Night Stalker, now aged 36, appeared far less formidable than the figure who had once terrorized the courtroom during his protracted trial back in 1989. Gone were his signature dark glasses, replaced instead by round prescription spectacles. His movements were tentative, almost awkward, betraying a sense of unease that contrasted sharply with his former menacing presence. The long-haired brunette, who had dreamt of becoming the Night Stalker's bride, had first reached out to him following his arrest in 1985. Over the course of his incarceration, she penned nearly 75 letters to him, each one a testament to her unwavering commitment. Her persistence was rewarded when, in 1988, he proposed, though prison regulations would delay their union. During this time, other women sought to claim him for themselves, visiting him in prison and lavishing him with attention. Doreen often encountered these rivals during her visits, and on more than one occasion she was met with threats of physical violence should she not relinquish her claim. Yet Doreen remained resolute, and ultimately she secured the man she desired. Doreen, who asserted that she was a virgin at the time of their marriage, knew that her status would remain unchanged, as conjugal visits were prohibited for those on death row. According to Philip Carlo, author of The Night Stalker, it was precisely her virginity that drew Ramirez to her. Raised in the Roman Catholic faith, Doreen had since embraced agnosticism, a belief system that allowed her to reconcile with Ramirez's avowed Satanism. When it came time to purchase their wedding rings, she chose a gold band for herself, but a platinum one for her soon-to-be husband. He had explained it to her simply. Satanists don't wear gold. The civil ceremony commenced promptly at 11:10 a.m., a rather unassuming affair in an undeniably peculiar setting. The officiant, Mr. L. Weister, had the unusual task of joining not one, but 3 inmates in matrimony to their respective brides that morning. Among those gathered were Ramirez's sister, Ruth, and his brother, Joseph, and Joseph's teenage daughter, whose presence drew the attention of the more unsavory elements in the room. Ever watchful, Ramirez leaned in to caution his niece, urging her to adjust her skirt as he noticed the wondering eyes of other inmates. As the couple stood before the officiant, Doreen radiated with an overwhelming sense of joy and fulfillment. It was as though all the trials and tribulations she had endured had led to this very moment. Finally, her long-cherished dream was becoming a reality. She was becoming Mrs. Richard Ramirez. It is clear that Doreen chose to disregard the overwhelming mountain of evidence presented during her husband's trial, particularly the harrowing testimonies that laid bare his abhorrent methods. Richard Ramirez, as the court heard in chilling detail, was a predator of the night. He would slip into the sanctity of his victims' bedrooms under the cover of darkness. The men were dealt with swiftly, typically with a single bullet to the head, an efficient and merciless end. The women, however, were subjected to far greater horrors. Ramirez kept them alive, relishing the control as he ransacked their homes in search of valuables. What then followed was an ordeal of unimaginable cruelty, rape and degradation often repeated, before he would finally, and most often, attempt to kill them. Remarkably, despite the savagery of his attacks, some of his victims managed to survive, bearing the scars of his brutality for the rest of their lives. Among the many serial killers who have haunted the annals of modern history, the Night Stalker stands out as perhaps the most sensational. His crimes were not only brutal, but carried out with a chilling flair that seemed almost cinematic in its horror. He was, in every sense, a living nightmare. A modern-day boogeyman who invaded the sanctity of bedrooms, tearing innocent people from their dreams and thrusting them into a waking terror. His methods, gruesome and theatrical, were reminiscent of a grade B horror film, yet tragically real in their execution. Los Angeles, with its sprawling urban landscape and pervasive sense of anonymity, proved to be the perfect hunting ground for such a predator. A city tailor-made for his dark and twisted pursuits. A Good Boy: How Ramirez Became the Night Stalker. In the year 1978, a young Ricardo Leiva, who would later be known as Richard Ramirez, left his hometown of El Paso, Texas, and made his way to Southern California. At just 18 years old, Ramirez had already dropped out of school, abandoning his education after the 9th grade. His life, by that point, had taken a rather aimless turn. He spent his days as a drifter, indulging in marijuana and subsisting on a diet of convenience-stored junk food, a lifestyle that, according to UPI reporters Aurelio Rojas and K-Max Sisk, was far from healthy. His overconsumption of sugary snacks led to the deterioration of his teeth, resulting in foul breath that only seemed to complement the dark and malevolent persona he was consciously crafting. Ramirez's habitual use of marijuana eventually caught up with him, leading to several arrests for possession, as well as a misdemeanor charge for theft. Once in California, his criminal activities escalated. He was arrested twice for auto theft, first in Pasadena in 1981 and then in Los Angeles in 1984. These early encounters with the law marked the beginning of his descent into the violent and horrific acts that would later earn him the moniker of the Night Stalker. Michael D. Harris, writing for UPI, noted years later, Richard's father would insist that his son was a good boy, but he also conceded that marijuana had put him out of control. Yet even with this claim, it remains difficult to determine precisely what influences steered Richard Ramirez toward a path of devil worship. Ramirez became fixated on the imagery and symbols associated with Satanism, often drawing the five-pointed pentagram, a symbol of the devil, upon his own body. His obsession was such that during his trial, he would openly shout "Hail Satan" in the courtroom, a chilling display of his allegiance to darker forces. His fascination with Satanism was further fueled by his love for certain rock bands, particularly those that dabbled in the themes of the occult. Of these, the heavy metal band AC/DC held a special place in his heart. Their album, Highway to Hell, was his absolute favourite, with one track in particular, Night Prowler, seeming to resonate deeply with him. The lyrics, which speak of a menacing presence lurking outside a window, slipping into a room under cover of darkness, eerily foreshadowed the crimes Ramirez would later commit. However, it is difficult to believe that rock music and marijuana alone could transform a wayward youth into one of the most monstrous serial rapists and murderers in modern history. The roots of his evil run far deeper, tangled in a web of psychological, environmental, and perhaps even supernatural influences. The turning point in Richard Ramirez's life can perhaps be traced to one horrifying night when he witnessed his cousin, Mike, murder his wife. Mike, a former Green Beret who had fought in Vietnam, was a man deeply scarred by the atrocities of war. Upon his return home, he boasted of the gruesome acts he had committed, torturing and mutilating the enemy, and even brought back Polaroids as twisted proof of his deeds. Richard, just 13 at the time, spent his days with Mike, often getting high together. And it was during one of these drug-fueled afternoons that Mike's wife began to nag him about straightening out his life and finding a job. In a sudden, shocking act of violence, Mike silenced her by pulling out a gun and shooting her in the face, killing her instantly. Author Philip Carlo, speaking on CNBC's Rivera Live, revealed that Ramirez was spattered with the woman's blood, a traumatic experience that no doubt left an indelible mark on his psyche. Mike's lawyer later cited the extreme stress from his wartime experiences as a mitigating factor, and although Mike was convicted, the judge was lenient in his sentencing. This event had a profound influence on Richard, who became fixated on the disturbing photographs of Mike's war victims. In the aftermath of the murder, Richard, the youngest of 5 siblings, began to spiral. An epileptic child, he started skipping school and smoking marijuana incessantly, eventually turning to theft to support his habit. The police have no evidence that Richard Ramirez committed any murders before he arrived in Los Angeles, and little is known about his activities in the early years he spent there. However, it is likely that his crimes were escalating during this period. What may have started as a simple theft soon progressed to breaking and entering, where he became increasingly skilled. Initially, he likely stole whatever valuables he could find and quickly left before he was caught. But as his confidence grew, so did his boldness. He began to stay longer in the homes he burglarized, perhaps watching the inhabitants as they slept or taking souvenirs, items that belonged to the women who lived there. Like his cousin Mike, he may have even taken photographs to relive the thrill of his exploits later. This behavior, no doubt, fueled the depraved fantasies that increasingly dominated his thoughts. Eventually, the need to act out these fantasies became too overwhelming to resist. The grotesque scenes that played out in his mind like a never-ending horror film were no longer enough. He had to bring them to life. When Richard Ramirez finally crossed that line and began acting on his darkest impulses, the Night Stalker was born. Whether through conscious decision or an inevitable descent into madness, Ramirez began to insert himself into his vile fantasies, taking pleasure in their brutal reenactment. His first victim was Jenny Winkle, a 79-year-old resident of Glassell Park. On the night of June 28, 1984, the weather had been particularly hot, and she had left a window open to let in some air. Ramirez, seizing the opportunity, removed the screen and climbed inside. The next morning, Winkow's son, who lived in the apartment above hers, discovered her lifeless body sprawled on the bed. She had been stabbed multiple times, and her throat was slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. The intruder had also ransacked the apartment, taking valuables before leaving. Fingerprints were recovered from the windowsill, and the autopsy revealed signs of sexual assault. In that moment, the Night Stalker's dark fantasy had fully manifested into gruesome reality. It would be another 8 months before he struck again. There is little doubt that Richard Ramirez, like so many budding serial killers, was fueled by the memory of his first victim. The act of rape and murder likely played out in his mind repeatedly, each time rekindling the horrific thrill of that night. There is little doubt that Richard Ramirez, like so many budding serial killers, was fueled by the memory of his first victim. The act of rape and murder likely played out in his mind repeatedly, each time rekindling the horrific thrill of that night. If he had taken what criminal profilers refer to as a souvenir, perhaps a hairbrush, a piece of underwear, or a pair of eyeglasses, anything intimately connected with the victim, such an object would have served to stoke his dark recollections, allowing him to elaborate on the fantasy. But eventually, the mental reenactment of that initial crime would lose its potency. The satisfaction it once brought would diminish, leaving him with an insatiable hunger for a new experience. Though he might have tried to control these urges, the pressure within him was mounting. Sooner or later, he would succumb to the compulsion and strike again. On the night of March 17, 1985, at precisely 11:30 p.m., 20-year-old Angela Barrios was returning home after a long, exhausting day at work. She lived in a condominium in Rosemead, a middle-class town located northeast of Los Angeles, which she shared with a roommate. As she pulled her car into the driveway and opened the garage door with her remote control, all she could think about was getting inside and unwinding after the day's toil. But as she stepped out of her car, she sensed something behind her. In an instant, a dark figure rushed towards her. He was tall, dressed entirely in black, with a navy blue baseball cap pulled low over his brow. In his hand he held a gun, which he pointed directly at her face, mere inches from her nose. Angela's heart raced as she pleaded for her life, her voice trembling with fear. She tried to avoid looking at his face, hoping that by doing so he might spare her. But her eyes betrayed her, and she caught a glimpse of his cold, hard gaze, eyes devoid of any mercy. Despite her desperate pleas, the man remained unmoved, perhaps even angered by her cries. Without a word, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed like a thunderclap in the enclosed space of the garage. Angela collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. She was alive, but paralyzed with fear, too terrified to move. The gunman stepped over her, kicking her body out of the way as he made his way to the door that led to her condo. Angela lay perfectly still, feigning death, unsure of how much time had passed when she finally noticed that her hand was bleeding. Her keys were still clutched in her hand. Instinctively, she had raised her hands when the man had pointed the gun at her, and in what could be described as a miracle, the bullet had struck her keys and ricocheted away. Gathering her wits, Angela got to her feet and started to flee, but as she reached the edge of the garage, another gunshot rang out behind her. She kept running, her only thought to escape, but in a cruel twist of fate, she ran straight into the man in black as he emerged from the front door of her condo. In a desperate bid to survive, Angela tried to get away from him, but her legs were shaky, and she stumbled back towards her car in the garage, convinced he was going to finish her off. But to her astonishment, the man did not pursue her. Instead, he shoved the gun into his belt and fled the scene. Angela Barrios, by sheer luck or providence, had been spared from this madman. Angela's roommate, Dale Okazaki, aged 34, was not as fortunate. When Angela stumbled into the kitchen, she was met with a horrifying sight. Dale lay face down on the floor, a pool of her own blood spreading beneath her. Blood splattered the walls, furniture, and appliances, painting a gruesome picture of the violence that had unfolded. Angela rushed to her side, desperately searching for any signs of life, but it was too late. Dale had been shot through the forehead. In a panic, Angela grabbed the phone and dialed 911. Later, when the police arrived and meticulously combed through the crime scene, they discovered the killer's baseball cap discarded in the garage. The exact events that transpired inside the condominium remain a mystery, but for reasons unknown, killing Dale Okazaki did not seem to provide Richard Ramirez with the satisfaction he craved. Astonishingly, that very same night he struck again, this time in nearby Monterey Park. According to author Clifford L. Leyendecker, a policeman was dispatched to investigate a seemingly abandoned yellow Chevrolet, its engine still running. The transmission was in reverse, and it was blocked from moving any further by another parked car. As the officer approached, he noticed an unconscious woman lying on the ground nearby. He rushed to her side, immediately checking her vital signs. Her stockings were torn, and a large unsightly bruise marred her leg. Though she was alive, she was barely clinging to life. The officer quickly returned to his patrol car to radio for an ambulance. When he went back to the woman, he spotted a metal medallion and a torn piece of a $20 bill lying on the pavement beside her. He attempted to revive her, hoping she might be able to tell him what had happened, but her breathing was labored and weak. In the dim light, he hadn't noticed that she had been shot multiple times. The woman, Sia Lian Yu, a 30-year-old Taiwanese native known to her friends as Victoria, died before the ambulance could arrive. It was clear that the killer was in a frenzy. The murder of Dale Okazaki had not quelled his insatiable thirst for violence, so, on a whim, he had attacked Sia Lian Yu. But even this brutal act did not seem to fulfill his dark desires, for just 3 days later, he committed another heinous crime, this time murdering an 8-year-old girl in Eagle Rock, California. A week later, on March 27, 1984, the Night Stalker resurfaced once again. This time, however, he found a method of operation that finally satisfied his twisted cravings. If you look at me again, I'll shoot you. On the morning of March 27, 1984, Peter Zazzara arrived at his parents' home in Whittier, California, expecting a normal visit. His 64-year-old father, Vincent, had retired from a successful career in investment counseling and now enjoyed running his own pizzeria. His mother, Maxine, 44, was a practicing attorney. When Peter rang the doorbell several times without a response, he decided to let himself in. What greeted him was a scene of unimaginable horror. In the den, Peter found his father's lifeless body slumped on the sofa. Vincent had been shot through the left temple, a wound so precise that it appeared he had died instantly. The true horror, however, awaited in the bedroom. Mrs. Zazzara lay stretched out on the bed, face up and naked. Her eyes had been gouged out, leaving behind nothing but bloody, empty sockets. Her body was a canvas of brutality, with stab wounds covering her face, neck, abdomen, and groin. A large T-shaped knife wound marred her left breast. An autopsy later revealed that, like her husband, she had been shot in the head and likely died instantly. The mutilation that had followed had been done post-mortem. The house had been ransacked and valuables were missing. With these murders, Richard Ramirez had refined a method that fulfilled his dark desires and fantasies, a method he would repeat many times over. dispatch the meal quickly to eliminate any obstacle, then indulge in his perverse acts upon the woman of the house. The man was merely a hindrance, an obstacle to be removed. The woman was the true object of his twisted desires. 6 weeks later, Richard Ramirez returned to Monterey Park, where he broke into the home of Harold and Jean Wu, rousing them from their sleep. He wasted no time in dealing with Mr. Wu, shooting the 63-year-old man through the head. He then turned his attention to Mrs. Wu, a 63-year-old woman who he viciously beat with his fists, demanding to know where she kept her money. Her concern for her husband rendered her incoherent, so Ramirez bound her hands behind her back with thumb cuffs to keep her still while he searched the house. After finding what he was after, he returned to the bedroom, dragging the tiny woman to the side of the bed and raped her. When he had satisfied his monstrous urges, he left. Mr. Wu, however, was not dead yet. Despite the grievous head wound inflicted upon him, he somehow managed to crawl to the den, where he dialed 911. Although he could not speak to the dispatcher, the call was traced, and both an ambulance and patrol car were swiftly dispatched to the Wu residence. Harold was rushed to the hospital, but tragically he succumbed to his injuries later that night. His wife, Jean Wu, survived the attack, but was treated for her injuries. In a remarkable act of courage, she provided the police with a physical description of her attacker. 2 weeks later, on May 30th, 41-year-old Ruth Wilson was jolted awake in the middle of the night by the harsh glare of a flashlight shining directly in her face. Richard Ramirez had silently infiltrated her Burbank home and now stood over her, a gun pointed directly at her head. With a cold command, he ordered her to get out of bed and led her to her 12-year-old son's room. Once there, Ramirez leapt onto the boy's bed, pressing the gun to his head while issuing a stern warning to Ruth to not make a sound. He then handcuffed the boy and locked him in a closet. "Don't look at me," he snarled at Ruth, his voice filled with venom. "If you look at me again, I'll shoot you." Believing that she was dealing with a burglar, Ruth offered him her most valuable possession, a gold and diamond necklace. Hoping to appease him, she led him to the dresser in her bedroom where she kept the necklace. But her attempt to placate him was in vain. After rummaging through the house, Ramirez coldly ordered her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. With a grim efficiency, he bound her wrists with a pair of pantyhose, then roughly shoved her onto the bed as she pleaded desperately for mercy. Ignoring her cries, he tore off her pink nightgown and proceeded to rape and sodomize her. The foul stench of his breath, hot against her skin, nearly made her gag as he violated her. According to Clifford L. Leyendecker in his book Night Stalker, Ruth Wilson, in an astonishing display of composure, told Ramirez that he must have had a very unhappy life to do something so horrific. His response was chillingly casual. He remarked that she looked pretty good for her age, and informed her that, unlike many others, he was going to let her live. When she complained that the pantyhose binding her wrists were cutting off her circulation, he loosened them slightly and even brought her a robe. Afterward, he retrieved her son from the closet, handcuffing the two of them side by side before finally leaving the house. Later, the boy managed to reach the phone and call 911. When the police asked Ruth to describe her attacker, she told them it was a tall Hispanic man with long dark hair. The attacks persisted, casting a long shadow of fear over the city of Los Angeles. Panic gripped the community as the elusive killer rapist continued his reign of terror. One police official dubbed him the Valley Intruder, while the newspapers sensationalized his crimes by calling him the Midnight Stalker, evoking images of a modern-day Dracula or Jack the Ripper. But Richard Ramirez was far from finished. In the spring of 1985, his violence escalated markedly, and by the summer, he had entered the phase of full-blown rampage. On May 29th, a particularly brutal crime was uncovered in Monrovia. where 83-year-old Malvia Keller and her 80-year-old invalid sister Blanche Wolfe were discovered in Malvia's home. The scene was one of unspeakable brutality. Both women had been beaten so savagely with a hammer that the weapon's handle had split from the force. Blanche bore a puncture wound above one ear, likely inflicted with the same hammer. On Malvia's inner thigh, an inverted pentagram had been drawn in lipstick, the tip pointing downward, a chilling symbol of the killer's dark obsessions. A second pentagram was scrawled on the bedroom wall above Blanche's comatose body. It appeared that Ramirez had attempted to rape Malvia, the elder sister. Police experts estimate that the sisters had been left in the house for about 2 days before being discovered. Although doctors managed to revive Blanche, Malvia succumbed to her horrific injuries soon after. A month later, on June 27th, the Night Stalker committed a terrible crime, targeting a young girl in Arcadia. The incident left the community in shock and deeply concerned for their safety. The following day, the body of 32-year-old Patty Elaine Higgins was discovered in her Arcadia home. She had suffered a fatal injury to her throat, and the violence of the crime deeply unsettled those who heard about it. Just 5 days later, on July 2nd, another tragedy struck the community when 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon was found in her Arcadia home. She had been attacked and suffered a similar fate to Patty Higgins, with her home left in disarray as well. On July 5th, Richard Ramirez returned to Arcadia, where he brutally assaulted 16-year-old Deirdre Palmer with a tire iron. Despite the severity of her injuries, Deirdre showed remarkable resilience and survived the attack. On August 18, 1985, a tragic scene was discovered in Lake Merced, a suburb of San Francisco. Peter and Barbara Pan were found in their bed, which was stained with blood. Both had suffered gunshot wounds to the head. Mr. Pan, a 66-year-old accountant, was pronounced dead at the scene, while Mrs. Pan, 64, survived but would unfortunately be an invalid for the rest of her life. On the wall, scrawled in lipstick, were the inverted pentagram and the words, "Jack the Knife," referencing a song by the heavy metal band Judas Priest. Local police determined that the perpetrator had entered through an open window. Fearing that Los Angeles' Night Stalker had moved north to their area, homicide investigators sent a bullet removed from Mr. Pan to a forensic team in Los Angeles, and the results confirmed their worst fears. The bullet matched those from the 2 Night Stalker crime scenes in Los Angeles County. As panic began to spread through San Francisco, police searched their unsolved homicide files and found 2 incidents that seemed to fit the Night Stalker's methods. On February 20th, 1985, sisters Mary and Christina Caldwell, ages 70 and 50, were tragically stabbed to death in their Telegraph Hill apartment. If this was indeed the work of the Night Stalker, it would mean he had committed this crime about a month before he killed Gail Okazaki and Siley Anu and wounded Angela Barrios in Los Angeles. Further investigation revealed that on June 2nd, just a day after the brutal attack on the elderly sisters Blanche Wolfe and Malvia Keller, 25-year-old Theodore Welding was shot in the head while he slept in his apartment in the Cow Hollow area of San Francisco. His girlfriend, Nancy Bryan, 25, was then assaulted by the intruder. These discoveries led to the troubling question: had the Night Stalker been active in San Francisco as well as Los Angeles throughout 1985, with the local police unaware of his presence? Fear quickly spread through the city by the bay. In an effort to calm the public, Mayor Dianne Feinstein spoke openly about the ongoing hunt for the Night Stalker. However, her decision to share details of the investigation angered detectives, who feared it might hinder their efforts to catch the elusive criminal. They were desperate to avoid a repeat of the situation Los Angeles had faced, where 15 brutal attacks, including 14 murders and 5 assaults, had been committed by a suspect who continued to evade capture. Despite the challenges, The San Francisco police caught a break when the manager of a flop house in the Tenderloin district came forward with important information. He reported that a young man matching the Night Stalker's description had stayed at his establishment on several occasions over the past year and a half. The manager noted that the man had severely decayed teeth and a noticeable odor. When the police checked the room where he had last stayed, they found a pentagram drawn on the bathroom door. The man had checked out August 17th, just one day before the attack on Mr. and Mrs. Pan. Investigators soon located a man from the El Sobrante district who reported that he had purchased some jewelry, a diamond ring and a pair of cufflinks, from a young man who matched the description of the Night Stalker. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that these items had belonged to Mr. Pan, linking the suspect to yet another crime. On August 24th, while the police in San Francisco were urgently searching for the mysterious young man with the distinctive dental condition, the Night Stalker had already set his sights on another unsuspecting couple. However, this time, his targets were not in the Bay Area. They were asleep in bed in Mission Viejo, 50 miles south of Los Angeles. A computer engineer and his 29-year-old fiancée had just drifted off to sleep when they were suddenly jolted awake by the sound of gunshots in their bedroom. Instinctively, she reached out to her fiancé, but he had been seriously wounded. Before she could fully comprehend the situation, the intruder grabbed her by the hair and dragged her into another room, where he tied her ankles and wrists with neckties. The man then asked her if she knew who he was, revealing that he was the notorious figure dominating the news and television reports. He began to rummage through the house in search of valuables, but finding little of worth, his anger grew. Frustrated by the couple's lack of possessions, he returned to her and assaulted her, compounding the terror of the night. Still enraged by the lack of valuables, the intruder demanded to know if there was any money hidden in the house. Terrified of what he might do next, she told him about a drawer where she knew her fiancé kept some cash. "Swear to Satan," he demanded, his voice menacing. Frightened and desperate, she did as he asked, swearing to Satan that she was telling the truth. The stalker found the money, and as he counted it, he mocked her, telling her this was all she was worth and that it had saved her life. She prayed that this ordeal was finally over and that he would leave now that he had taken the money. But he wasn't done yet. Instead, he insisted she swear her love for Satan, and afraid of what might happen next, she complied, and mumbled that she loved Satan. He forced her to repeat it over and over, then yanking her by the hair, he made her kneel and perform another humiliating act. When he was finished, he stepped back, staring at her. Still bound by the neckties, she feared he was about to end her life just as he had attacked her fiancé, but instead, he laughed cruelly and abruptly left. She quickly freed herself from the neckties and rushed to the window, just in time to see him getting into an orange-colored Toyota station wagon. Without delay, she called 911. Earlier that night, a teenager working on his motorcycle in his parents' garage had noticed the orange Toyota driving into the neighborhood. Something about it struck him as odd, and when he saw it again as it was leaving, he became suspicious. Acting on his instincts, he jotted down the license plate number, and the next morning he contacted the police about the car. With the license plate number in hand, the police were able to trace the 1976 orange Toyota to a theft in LA's Chinatown. The car had been stolen while its owner was dining at a local restaurant. An alert was immediately put out for the vehicle, and just 2 days later, it was located in the Rampart section of Los Angeles. Hoping to catch the Night Stalker, the police kept the car under close surveillance for nearly 24 hours. But their suspect never returned. Undeterred, a forensic team meticulously examined the car for any evidence that could lead to the elusive criminal. Their efforts paid off when they discovered a single clear fingerprint. The print was promptly sent to Sacramento for analysis. Just hours later, the computer system returned a match. The fingerprint belonged to Ricardo Richard Leyva Ramirez. Further analysis confirmed that this print matched one found on a windowsill at the Pan residence near San Francisco. At long last, the police knew the identity of their suspect. Now, their challenge was to locate him before he could strike again. I love to kill people. 7 days after the attack on the computer engineer and his fiancée in Mission Viejo, Richard Ramirez was on the hunt for another vehicle to steal. Unfortunately for him, he chose the wrong neighborhood to go shopping for cars. The 3700 block of East Hubbard Street in Los Angeles is a tightly knit, predominantly Hispanic community. Ramirez might have assumed he would blend in easily there, but he underestimated how determined these residents were to protect their property. Ramirez's first mistake was attempting to steal Faustino Pinon's cherished red Mustang. Dressed in a black Jack Daniels t-shirt, Ramirez had been hopping fancies searching for a car he could easily take. He'd been chased off the property next door to Pinon's home and found himself in Pinon's yard. Spotting the Mustang parked in the driveway, Ramirez must have thought he had struck gold. The car was unlocked and the keys were in the ignition. He jumped in and started the engine, confident in his luck. However, he hadn't realized that the car's owner was lying underneath the vehicle working on the transmission. The moment Pinon 56 heard the engine roar to life, he rolled out from under the car. Furious that someone would dare touch his prized possession, Pinon reached through the open window and grabbed Ramirez by the neck. Ramirez warned that he had a gun, but Pinon wasn't about to let anyone take his car without a fight. Ramirez tried to drive away, but Pinon held on tight. The Mustang lurched forward, crashing into a fence and then into the garage. Determined to stop the thief, Pinon yanked the door open again, hauled Ramirez out, and threw him to the ground. Ramirez scrambled to his feet and dashed across the street, just as 28-year-old Angela De La Torres was getting into her Ford Granada. Desperately, he ran up to her car and leaned through the driver's window, demanding her keys and threatening her in Spanish if she didn't comply. Terrified, she screamed for help. Her husband, Manuel, 32, heard her cries and came running from the backyard. As he rushed through the gate along the side of the house, he grabbed a metal fence post, ready to defend his wife. Meanwhile, Jose Burgoyne, who had heard the commotion at Faustino Pinon's driveway, had already called the police. Sensing that more help was needed, he ran outside to assist Pinon. As he did, he heard Angelina's screams and quickly called out to his sons, Jamie, 21, and Julio, 17, to join him. The brothers sprinted towards Mrs. De La Torres just in time to see a thin stranger scrambling across the front seat of her car. Jamie, recognizing the man from photographs published in the newspapers and broadcasts on television, shouted out in alarm. This was the Night Stalker, the notorious criminal they had all been warned about. The man launched into a determined pursuit. Ramirez ran as fast as he could, but Manuel De La Torres was close behind him and struck him across the neck with a 3.5-foot metal post. Ramirez kept running, but De La Torres didn't let up, landing blows from behind as he chased him. Jamie Burgoyne soon caught up with Ramirez and managed to punch him. Ramirez stumbled and fell, but quickly scrambled to his feet and continued running, with De La Torres and the Burgoyne brothers hot on his trail. Then, in an unexpected turn, Ramirez suddenly stopped and turned to face his pursuers. His eyes flashed as he laughed, and mockingly stuck out his tongue at them, playing the part of a madman. But the men were only momentarily taken aback. They quickly regained their momentum and lunged at him, resuming the chase. Finally, a block away from where it all began, De La Torres delivered a strong blow to Ramirez's head, bringing him down. The Night Stalker collapsed to the ground, and Jamie and Jose Burgoyne quickly moved in to hold him down until the police arrived. One day after Richard Ramirez's face was made public, the Night Stalker was in custody and behind bars. Legal delays. Upon his arrest, 26-year-old Richard Ramirez was charged with 14 murders and 31 other felonies related to his 1985 spree of violent crimes, including murder, assault, and robbery. In addition to these charges, a 15th murder in San Francisco was also attributed to him, and there was the possibility of a trial in Orange County for additional crimes. Early in the case, 2 public defenders were assigned to represent Richard Ramirez, but he quickly expressed his dissatisfaction with them. Another defense attorney briefly took over, but soon departed. Eventually, the Ramirez family hired Daniel and Arturo Hernandez, no relation to each other. While they had experience working on homicide cases, neither had tried a death penalty case before. Their situation wasn't helped when, during the arraignment in October 1985, Ramirez dramatically displayed a pentagram drawn on his palm and shouted "Hail Satan" in the courtroom. This kind of behavior understandably heightened tensions. On one occasion, when the courtroom lights unexpectedly went out, the deputy marshals immediately drew their pistols and instructed everyone to hit the floor. Ramirez was quickly escorted out of the courtroom. The Hernandez's brothers began their defense with a series of pre-trial motions, including a request for a change of venue. They argued that the extensive media coverage in Los Angeles County had deeply influenced the community, making it impossible to find an impartial jury. They claimed that many people in the area harbored a strong image of the Night Stalker as a terrifying figure who might break into their homes. To support their claim, they conducted a survey which showed that 93% of 300 people polled were familiar with Ramirez, and the majority believed he was guilty. On January 10, 1987, the Los Angeles Times reported the outcome of this 13-day hearing. Judge Dion Morrow dismissed the defense's argument, stating that with substantial pull of potential jurors in the county, it would still be possible to find an impartial jury. "This is the largest community, I think, of any court system in the country," he remarked. As Ramirez was led out of the courtroom in chains, he grinned at a group of female supporters who had gathered. Some believed in his innocence, while others were simply drawn to his appearance. In another hearing, Judge Elva Soper granted a gag order, restricting both the prosecution and defense from discussing the case publicly. By May, a trial date was set for the end of September. However, this timeline soon proved to be overly optimistic. The case would eventually extend beyond California, involving witnesses and evidence from other states and even Mexico. The defense team also introduced numerous delays, ranging from appeals to out-of-town interviews to sudden disappearances. Richard Ramirez made a rare appearance in pre-trial proceedings. Dressed in a 3-piece grey suit and red tie, during this appearance, he denied having spontaneously confessed to Sergeant Ed Esqueda upon his arrest on August 31st, claiming, "I did, you guys got me, the stalker." His defense attorneys argued that the officer had not recorded the statement and sought to have it dismissed from the record. However, Superior Court Judge Michael Tynan, who was assigned to oversee the trial, denied the motion. Later, during the trial, Sergeant George Thomas would testify that Ramirez had said, "Of course I did it, so what? Shoot me, I deserve to die," and then hummed a tune titled Night Prowler. Aside from his brief testimony, Ramirez appeared largely disinterested in the proceedings, often slouching in his chair, drumming his fingers on the table, and nodding his head as though listening to music. He seemed indifferent to the gravity of the charges he faced. Throughout the final months of 1987, the Hernandezes, his defense attorneys, repeatedly insisted that they needed more time to prepare, resulting in the trial date being pushed to February. They even considered delaying the trial further by pursuing the Orange County case first. In November, in an effort to avoid an additional trial, 1 murder and 1 felony count were dismissed. The prosecution had little to go on for the murder charge, relying mainly on the delayed statement of a witness who had seen Ramirez near the crime scene. Judge Tynan also ruled that Ramirez could not be transferred to Orange County, preventing him from being arraigned there. As a new tactic, the defense prepared to request that at least 6 separate trials be held, arguing that weaker cases should not be strengthened by association with stronger ones. By January, it seemed likely that the trial would be postponed another 6 months. An appellate court had required the prosecution to provide the defense with records of all similar cases committed in Los Angeles counties over a 6-month period. The defense hoped to link some of the charges against Ramirez to other cases, possibly involving different offenders. Prosecutor Phil Halpin called this an onerous burden on law enforcement and asked the court to reconsider. Both sides took the matter to the state Supreme Court, but it refused to hear the case. Meanwhile, San Francisco authorities had tentatively linked Ramirez to 4 homicides, a sexual assault, and 10 burglaries. However, due to lack of physical evidence in most of these cases, they decided to focus on one killing, Peter Pan, one attempted murder, Mrs. Pan, and the burglary that had provided the evidence leading to Ramirez's identification. They awaited the conclusion of the Los Angeles trial to determine when to proceed. In July, nearly 3 years after Ramirez's arrest, the Los Angeles Times reported that Ramirez had decided against pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. The judge ordered jury selection to begin, estimating that this process alone could take 6 to 8 months. The defense had unsuccessfully sought to have Judge Tynan disqualified, claiming he was biased against their client. Once again, they claimed they needed more time to prepare. LA County Prosecutor Phil Halpin, growing impatient with the defense's numerous motions, many of which aimed to suppress evidence, finalized his case and filed the charges, catching the defense off guard. Halpin stated that he had nearly 1,000 potential witnesses and hundreds of thousands of pages of statements, reports, and photographs, admitting this was one of the most complex criminal cases he had encountered. He projected a 2-year trial period. By this point, the case had already cost over $1 million and 1 witness had died. Despite the defense's request for yet another extension, it was time to begin the trial. The Los Angeles trial. On July 21, 1988, the long-awaited jury selection for Richard Ramirez's trial finally began. At the same time, in nearby Orange County, a jury was being selected for another high-profile case, that of Randy Kraft, who was accused of killing 16 young men. Judge Michael Tynan knew the challenges ahead. They needed to find 12 jurors and 12 alternates who were not only impartial, but also willing and able to serve for up to 2 years, a significant commitment, even in Los Angeles County. To accommodate this large jury, carpenters were brought in to enlarge the jury box. Judge Tynan estimated they might have to interview as many as 2,000 potential jurors, though they ultimately interviewed just under 1,600. Alan Yokelson joined Phil Halpin on the prosecution team, and during the voir dire, tensions ran high. Halpin and Daniel Hernandez, one of Ramirez's defense attorneys, exchanged so many insults that Judge Tynan suggested they settle their differences in a boxing ring. He chastised both attorneys, calling their behavior unprofessional. To ensure the defense was adequately supported, Judge Tynan assigned public defender Ray Clark to assist Daniel Hernandez, as Arturo Hernandez, the other defense attorney, was not always present during the proceedings. The defense team had yet to disclose their strategy, and they had numerous appeals still pending, particularly one seeking to overturn the decision by a judge who had refused to remove Judge Tynan from the case. Richard Ramirez, often dressed in all black, began wearing sunglasses in the courtroom, adding to his mysterious persona, although he kept his hair long and unkempt, reinforcing his rebellious image. He gradually became more involved in the trial proceedings. On August 3rd, the Los Angeles Times reported that jail employees had overheard a plan for Ramirez to shoot and kill the prosecutor, using a gun that someone was allegedly planning to slip him in the courtroom. As a result, a metal detector was installed outside the courtroom, and even the lawyers were subjected to searches. Ramirez appeared surprised by this development, but no gun was ever found. After several months, a jury of 12, along with alternates, was finally seated. However, one juror was dismissed for making racially biased statements about the death penalty. In January 1989, a state appeals court found Daniel Hernandez deficient in representing another client in a previous murder trial. Hernandez reportedly was not surprised by the decision and had a history of seeking delays due to medical conditions related to stress. Many questioned why Ramirez's family had hired such an inexperienced attorney, but Hernandez continued to seek delays. By the end of January, on the 30th, the trial officially began. Prosecutor Phil Halpin delivered a 2-hour opening statement detailing the 13 murders and 30 felony charges against Ramirez. Halpin planned to present at least 400 pieces of evidence, including fingerprints, ballistic evidence, and shoe impressions, one of which had been left on the face of a victim. On the same day, the Times reported that Ramirez had allegedly referred to himself as a supercriminal while in jail in 1985, boasting that he loved to kill and had murdered 20 people. "I love all that blood," a sheriff's deputy claimed Ramirez had said. Halpin intended to introduce these statements as evidence. Daniel Hernandez declined to make an opening statement at this stage, keeping his strategy under wraps. As the trial progressed, the case truly began to unfold. While some witnesses struggled to recall details from the crimes that had occurred 4 years earlier, others were certain in their identification of Richard Ramirez. A few witnesses provided detailed accounts of their traumatic encounters with Ramirez, sometimes as he sat calmly flipping through a notebook filled with crime scene photos. When asked to remove his sunglasses, Ramirez refused, maintaining his defiant stance. Prosecutor Phil Halpin built his case against Richard Ramirez using a combination of circumstantial evidence and more concrete findings. He linked Ramirez to the crimes through the distinctive Avia shoes that left prints at multiple crime scenes, sightings of Ramirez in the vicinity of the crimes, and the varying methods he used, as well as items that had been taken from the victims or their homes. In addition to this, Halpin presented fingerprint evidence and what he termed signature evidence, specific characteristics that linked the crimes to Ramirez. On April 14th, after calling 137 witnesses and presenting 521 exhibits, the prosecution rested its case. However, it soon became clear that the defense's strategy would hinge on discrediting the eyewitnesses, some of whom were survivors, arguing they had all mistakenly identified Ramirez. The defense suggested that another person was responsible for the crimes. The court granted the defense 2 weeks to prepare their case. One significant challenge the defense team faced was addressing the numerous pentagrams left at the crime scenes, on a car that bore Ramirez's fingerprint, on the thigh of a victim, and even on Ramirez himself and in his cell. These pentagrams were key in linking the crimes, especially since Ramirez had proclaimed himself a Satanist. He had allegedly forced one surviving victim to swear allegiance to Satan during the assault in which her husband was shot. Additionally, there was fingerprint evidence. The distinctive Avia shoe impressions, although the shoes themselves were never found, and ballistics evidence showing the use of 4 different guns, one of which was traced back to a man who claimed to have received it from Ramirez. The defense officially began presenting its case on May 9th after a 3-week delay. Part of this delay was due to the fact that on May 2nd, one of the prosecution's witnesses was ordered to retestify after it was discovered he had withheld information while under oath. This witness had described jewelry and consumer items linked to the victims, which he had received from Ramirez. Halpin himself uncovered the deception and maintained that it did not damage the case. However, Hernandez saw this as a potential opportunity for an appeal. On May the 4th, the Los Angeles Times published an article describing Ramirez's state of mind as gloomy and distraught, suggesting that he did not want to put on a defense. Ramirez's lawyers informed the judge that this was a possibility, although they had advised against it. Judge Tynan granted a recess so that the defense team could discuss the situation further with their client. Ultimately, it was decided to proceed with the trial, and the defense called 38 witnesses to the stand. The defense team argued that the prosecution's evidence was either inconclusive or flawed. They pointed out that many fingerprints at the crime scenes remained unidentified, and that hairs and blood samples were found that did not match either the victims or Ramirez. In a surprising move, the defense called Ramirez's father to testify that Richard had been in El Paso, Texas for 8 days starting around May 24, 1985. This alibi was significant because a rape victim had identified Ramirez as being in her home on Memorial Day, and another attack that resulted in murder occurred between May 29th and June 1st. Additionally, the defense presented testimony suggesting that police officers had covertly guided witnesses during lineups after Ramirez's arrest, possibly influencing their identification. The defense also called psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, an expert in eyewitness testimony from the University of Washington. She testified that the stress of an assault could affect a witness's ability to recall details accurately, and that errors in identification were more likely when the attacker and victim were of different races. However, under cross-examination, Loftus conceded that victims who had more than a fleeting encounter with Ramirez were likely to be more accurate in their identification. On May 25th, the defense called Sandra Hodgkiss as a witness. She claimed to have been an accomplice of Richard Ramirez in numerous daytime burglaries during 1985, some of which had overlapped with the period of his alleged murder spree. Hodgkiss testified that none of these burglaries were violent and described Ramirez as nervous and inexperienced. She stated that she eventually cut ties with him, but was later arrested and convicted for other burglaries. During this phase of the trial, several disruptions occurred, including charts falling from easels, defense attorney Daniel Hernandez perspiring heavily, and evidence being misrepresented. The newspapers pointed out that the defense team had not once claimed that their client was innocent. Hernandez himself remarked that their goal was to demonstrate flaws in the prosecution's case rather than to prove outright innocence. The prosecution's rebuttal witness challenged the testimony of Ramirez's father, showing that Ramirez was actually in Los Angeles having dental work done at the time his father claimed he was in El Paso. A comparison of Ramirez's dental records to the charts confirmed this, even though Ramirez had used an alias. Additionally, a newspaper reporter, David Hancock, contradicted the alibi by revealing that in August 1985, Ramirez's father had stated he hadn't seen his son in at least 2 years. Daniel Hernandez was permitted to fly to Texas to search for additional witnesses who might have seen Ramirez. The jury was given a break and allowed to go on vacation until July 10th, although Hernandez found 2 witnesses, Halpin countered by suggesting that Ramirez could have flown back to Los Angeles in time to commit the crimes in question. Furthermore, one survivor identified a piece of jewelry as hers, which had been found in the El Paso home of Ramirez's sister, while relatives of a woman murdered in May 1985 had photographs of appliances from her home that had been in Ramirez's possession. In closing arguments, which lasted from July 12th to 25th, both sides emphasized the weaknesses in the other's case and strengths in their own. Halpin criticized Hernandez for raising issues without providing evidence, arguing that these were mere distractions thrown at the jury. While Halpin finished his argument, Ramirez turned to the courtroom and smirked. Judge Tynan took 2 days to instruct the jury, informing them that a handgun was missing from the evidence inventory, but they had a photograph of it. After nearly a year of proceedings, the jury began deliberations on July 26, armed with 8,000 pages of trial transcripts and 655 exhibits to consider. Within a week, one juror who frequently fell asleep was replaced. Then on August 14th, a significant event shook the courtroom. Phyllis Singletary, one of the jurors, failed to arrive. The judge summoned the jury and informed them they would not proceed without her, and the court was recessed for the day. The next day, the shocking news broke. Ms. Singletary had been found shot to death in her apartment. This unsettling development spread quickly among the jurors and the 8 remaining alternates. They couldn't help but wonder if Ramirez had somehow orchestrated this from his prison cell, and whether any of them might be next. Their fears were heightened by the presence of Ramirez's black-clad supporters who attended the trial daily, drawing eerie comparisons to the Charles Manson cult of 1969. The following day, Judge Tynan called the jurors into the court and informed them that Miss Singletary had been shot by her abusive boyfriend. He had assured them the incident was unrelated to the case. An alternate was chosen to replace her, although the new juror was so overcome with fear that she struggled to walk to her place. Further news soon followed. Miss Singletary's boyfriend had used the same weapon to take his own life in a hotel, leaving behind a written confession. It was revealed that the couple had been arguing about the Ramirez case, and he had become enraged by her disapproval of Ramirez's lawyers. In response, the defense team made a strong push for a mistrial, which Prosecutor Halpin firmly opposed, insisting the case must not go down the drain. Debates quickly emerged in the media over the issue, with one psychologist suggesting that the shooting might unconsciously influence the jury against the defendant. However, the jury foreman assured the judge that they could continue with their deliberations. When Ramirez heard this in court, he reacted angrily, shouting that the situation was all messed up, and he had to be physically restrained. His disruptive behavior continued throughout the rest of the deliberations, during which he repeatedly claimed that the trial had been unfair. Eventually, he was allowed to waive his right to be present in court, and whenever brief hearings were necessary, the proceedings were piped into his holding cell. On September 20th, nearly 2 months after they had begun deliberations, the jury announced that they had reached a unanimous decision. Ramirez chose not to attend the reading, and neither did his group of female supporters. On each of the 43 counts, the jury found Ramirez guilty and affirmed 19 special circumstances that made him eligible for the death penalty. Upon leaving his cell, Ramirez flashed a devil's sign, 2 fingers raised to form horns at photographers, and made a single comment: evil. The defense team requested Ramirez's assistance during the penalty phase, knowing that without mitigating factors he would almost certainly be sentenced to death. "Dying doesn't scare me," he responded. "I'll be in hell with Satan." He made it clear to his lawyers that he would not plead for his life. In a surprising move, the defense offered no witnesses and did not call Ramirez to testify on his own behalf during this phase. Halpin later admitted that this decision caught him flat-footed. Defense attorney Ray Clark simply argued before the jury that something was clearly wrong with Ramirez and they should show compassion, even sympathy for the devil. Halpin reviewed his arguments from the trial and urged the jury to deliver what he called Ramirez's just desserts. On October 3rd, 1989, after 4 days of deliberations, the jury returned with their decision. They had voted for the death penalty for Richard Ramirez. Several female jurors were visibly emotional, with tears in their eyes. Ramirez, who was present for the verdict, was led out of the courtroom smiling. "Big deal," he remarked. "Death always went with the territory." Later, as he was escorted back to the county jail in shackles, he addressed reporters with a chilling final comment: "I'll see you in Disneyland." On November 9th, Richard Ramirez was officially sentenced to death 19 times. Throughout the sentencing, Ramirez casually chatted with his attorneys, seemingly unfazed by the gravity of the moment. Afterward, he attempted to further solidify his dark image with a cryptic speech to the court. "You do not understand me. I do not expect you to. You are not capable of it. I am beyond your experience. I am beyond good and evil. Legions of the night, Nightbreed, repeat not the errors of Night Prowler and show no mercy. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells within us all." He went on to denounce the court officials, calling them liars, haters, and parasitic worms, and insisted that he had been misunderstood, as Ramirez was led away, destined to join the 262 inmates already in death row in San Quentin, including the infamous freeway killer Randy Kraft, who had been sentenced just a month earlier. He nonchalantly asked, "Where are the women?" before boarding the bus. He flashed his two-fingered devil symbol at the busload of female prisoners, who responded by shouting "killer" at him. This brought a smile to his face.